All right. Red light in our top corner here. We're live. We're here. Hey, great to be with you. It's Shed here, and I'm joined with a new friend, Matt Blumberg. Let us know, hop into the chat, say hello, let us know that you are here. Good to see Alejandro here, per usual, in Chile, good friend. But hop in, let us know that you're here. And delighted to be joined by Matt. How you doing today, Matt?
I'm good, Shed. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And you are in New York State, yes?
I am. I'm just outside Manhattan, just north of the city.
Nice. So as you join, feel free, hop into the chat. Let us know where you are from. Great to see people pouring in and joining. So Matt and I were introduced a few months ago. I feel like we first spoke toward the beginning of this year, maybe February. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, January, February, something like that.
Cool, wonderful. We have someone, Ken, here from Finland. Welcome, Ken. So Matt and I, Jake Butler, the very person who connected us
Exactly.
on cue, entered. This is beautiful. So Jake from the Endeavor Network actually introduced Matt and I. I do some mentorship work with the Endeavor Network, and Matt is involved with Endeavor as well. And we connected, and we had this sort of two kindred spirits conversation. Matt, very much a practitioner of scaling up businesses. He's had a great career doing so with many organizations, one of which 1-800 Movie turned online, which for anyone who's a Seinfeld or a Kramer fan out there, you'll know that reference. But Matt has successfully grown, scaled many organizations and businesses. He now leads Bolster, which is an organization that helps to place talent inside of startup scale-ups. Won't steal the thunder there for you, Matt, and let you introduce that and introduce you. But I really wanted to have this conversation as someone who, myself, I'm obsessed with leadership, with culture, with scaling and growing leadership and culture, and how do you actually do that? And I thought you were a brilliant person to have this conversation with on how you've seen culture morph and change and sort of enter into a debate. Can we scale culture? Because you've written books on how to scale startups and scale functions, but can we scale leadership and culture? So that's why we're here, and great to see so many people joining us. So Matt, I'll just pass over to you to share any sort of opening remarks or things that I messed up in your bio, and we can go from there.
No, other than that, we never managed to get an 800 number together at Moviefone, which I only mentioned because it was, if anyone from Moviefone ever sees this, they will laugh at that. It was a topic of discussion for like years and years and years. But people would know it by its local phone numbers, like 777 film. Or the like, no, it's great to be here. The bulk of my experience, although I've led a few organizations, was for 20 years scaling a company called Return Path in the email business, and getting into a decent scale. We had about 500 people, 12 offices around the world, and for about 20 years. So we spent a long time at it, and my leadership team and my colleagues and I were so obsessed with culture and with scaling the business and scaling the leadership team and scaling the board and all those things that after we sold Return Path, we actually decided to start a whole company to help other companies do that. So I look forward to chewing through the topic with you today.
Nice, amazing. So great to see such an international audience. Though Jake is usually in Indianapolis, he's dialing in from Dublin. So welcome, good evening from Dublin. Great to see Manuela, Cesar. This is awesome. And Tina, my friend from Houston, Mary, as usual. This is fantastic. So Matt, without further ado, let's dive in, let's hop in. And per usual, everyone, please feel free to chime in with questions and comments as we go. We want to make this very interactive and have your questions answered. Mary's already chomping at the bit. Love that, Mary. So Matt, as you've seen, is the right conversation here to be having, how does culture scale or how does culture morph?
Yes, exactly. So good culture does both. And, one of the things that I always say is I think people get culture and values confused a lot, or at least use them synonymously. And in my mind, they're not quite synonymous. I sort of think of like values as bedrock. Like bedrock doesn't move. If it moves, it's because the tectonic plates are moving so slowly that it's an inch a year and you can't see them. And culture, though, which is sort of the the embodiment of the values, does evolve. It has to evolve. It has to evolve as organizations both go through time and scale up, and those two things can actually interact with each other and be a little bit different. But I believe very strongly that cultures that don't evolve actually die over time. So I think there are two different topics. What are best practices or normal practices for cultures evolving, and then how do you think very intentionally about scaling a culture?
Love that. So one, I think I maybe mentioned this to you the last time we spoke, but so one thing I'm playing with is an equation for culture. Not that I think the math needs to be perfect, but I think you're proving it. So there's a couple points I want to unpack here with you. So one is, I believe culture equals, in parentheses, values multiplied by behavior, raised to the power of power. Why? Because it's really fun to say power of power, but I'll explain it. So I agree with you. We ought to have values. I don't think the values should change. The way in which they're implemented or expressed or lived may evolve as the organization grows and evolves. And to your point, you said with Return Path, you had 20 different offices, or you were in 20 different, was it countries?
We had 12 locations and I think 7 countries. Although, by the way, you could argue that, Silicon Valley, you have to carry a passport to get in there, and New York City is its own thing, and Indianapolis is its own thing, and Austin and Boulder. But we were in a bunch of countries as well. But it was also 20 years. So we saw an evolution over a long period of time, too.
But what I think is important in sharing here is there's such a thing as subcultures. As an organization goes from a founding core of 2 or 5 people, you then bring on 15, another inflection point, 50. You said you got up to about, how many employees was it? Was it about 500?
About 500, yeah.
Right? Like, you can have subcultures within teams and departments. And so I think the same values may be expressed in different ways.
Absolutely. You can have them with teams. You can have them with offices as well. And we certainly had that. The office in Paris was really different from the office in Boulder. I would say we were more sensitive to that when we set up offices outside the U.S. than the maybe differences inside the U.S., although those are equally real. Anytime we hired a country manager, we always said to him or her, your job is to blend local business culture with Return Path business culture. So each of those offices had a little bit of their own feel, but what was non-negotiable were the values. And everyone had to play by that same set of rules. And if the embodiment was a little bit different in different places, that was okay. But there were some things that were not okay to be that different. We had, I think culture, which is really hard to define, is sort of, it's a collection of artifacts and programs and policies and practices. And we had, I'll give you an example of an artifact that was non-negotiable. So the culture at Return Path, we define very much as a people first culture. We had up on the wall of every office and a framed 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that each employee made before he or she started, which was what we called their visual bio. So it was like, the poster of you. And on your first day, it got sent around to the whole company as welcome. And then it got framed and put on the wall. And they were all lined up in order of start date on the wall. That was not negotiable, right? That was a really important embodiment of the values in the culture. And it didn't matter if you walked into our office in Boulder or Indianapolis or New York or California, like they were all there. The smaller offices, we had them scrolling on, something digitally because we couldn't fit them all up. But that was something that wasn't negotiable, where, there were probably things about work hours or flexibility or working from home that might have varied a little bit from team to team or office to office.
Nice. But what I love about that is that sends through a physical, tangible thing. This is the type of workplace. This is the story I make up. This is the type of workplace in which we celebrate people bringing their whole and full selves to work.
100%.
Which is, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, don't work here.
Right.
Right. But that's a hallmark of psychological safety, which people can bring their whole and true selves and not have to, put on corporate garb. So I love that. Very cool. So yes, thank you, Alejandro. That culture equation, values multiplied by behavior. So to Matt's point, if you have these values but you don't live them, anything multiplied by a 0 is 0. Anything multiplied by a negative is a negative. So if you say it but don't do it, or worse, live counter to it, now you have a toxic, deleterious culture. And then Matt, the other piece of this equation that I'm playing with is the more power, meaning you have possession over desired resources. So now, like you as CEO and chairperson at Bolster, which is the new organization you're working on now, if you don't live the values, that means more than if someone more junior who was brought on doesn't. Like your whisper is a shout inside that organization.
Yeah, I mean that's always true. Leaders live in a fishbowl, and the more of a leader you are, the more of a fishbowl you're in, for sure. It's interesting to hear you say that, because when I saw that when I first heard you saying the word power, I thought, like, that's actually kind of counter to a lot of my beliefs about scaling culture, which is that you can't do that from the top. Mm-hmm. But I think your point is right, which is that you can tear down a culture in a hurry from the top. You can't necessarily make everyone do everything, but if people see you, if people witness that, what I call the say-do gap, and I have a million stories about awful say-do gaps that I've seen in my life. But people see that, that just undermines everything.
Totally. Any stories or things that come to mind that you think will be useful there, or we can keep moving on if you want?
So I'll give you one, and the names will be changed to protect the guilty. I worked at a company before I started Return Path that was very frugal. And the company actually didn't have documented values, but if it had them, one of them would be frugality. And there was an expense policy that was incredibly detailed, and not out of line for what companies did, at the time, but very detailed. You can spend $10 on this and $15 on that, and you're only allowed to take a taxi home if you work after 8, but not during the summer when it's still light out. And, you can only spend $160 on a hotel, like really, really prescriptive. Mm-hmm. And everyone followed it except the CEO. And the CEO, spent whatever he wanted. And, he would be on a trip with some of us, and we'd be staying in, the Holiday Inn, and he'd be staying at the Four Seasons. And there might have actually been a little bit of logic to it at times. Like he was entertaining clients a little bit more than the rest of us were. But the fact is, we had this incredibly prescriptive policy that everyone followed except for him. Mm-hmm. And I called him out on it one day, and because it was just bugging me. And about a month later, HR put out a new version of the employee handbook. And the new version of the employee handbook literally said in it that, any executive officer defined as like president or COO or CFO could, break the policy using their own best judgment at any time. And I mean, it's sort of that kind of thing that's like, it just creates the corporate eye roll.
Yeah. And the division.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the ways I describe culture is the behavior you reward and the behavior you tolerate. Which I think is telling in that as well.
Yeah. And therefore the behavior you deserve.
Yeah. And the other thing, I like you said fishbowl, because I think one of the things that happens, so and maybe Matt, I'm listening, is power the right word, but maybe when explained, it makes sense. But the other thing that I think of with fishbowl is you're in a fishbowl and you can't taste the water you swim in. So I worked with an amazing leader from a great team, and he thought so highly of his team, but he kept saying to me, I think we have a great culture, but I can't taste the water that I swim in. And I'm like, yes, because he's saying that just because he or she or they are the leader doesn't mean that their opinion of the culture is the right one. Like
Mhm.
I've heard senior leaders, I've heard a founder, visionary CEO of a company say the culture of this company is great. To which my response was, you can't make that call. Like yours is but one opinion. So,
Right.
I mean, as you've led organizations, how do you? I mean, there are metrics and measures, and I know you've been on, lists of employers of choice with Return Path and others. But what are some of the ways that you have been able to feel culture is strong here, or culture is off here?
Yeah, I mean, as with most things, there are quantitative measurements, and they tell half the story, and the qualitative is the rest. And
Hmm.
the quantitative, and Bolster is very small. We only have 25 or 30 people, so we don't do some of these more advanced practices yet. But we were maniacal at Return Path about doing employee engagement surveys, not employee satisfaction surveys, although that obviously comes out, but employee engagement surveys.
Hmm.
We use Culture Amp, which is a really good tool, and it's not just a good survey instrument. It's good because it's got some very powerful benchmarks that you get when you get your survey results. Sort of companies like you, companies in your sector at your stage or size. Here's what their numbers look like. So we were pretty maniacal about running that survey 4 times a year. We ran a big one once a year,
Hmm.
um, and then we did like a mini one 3 times a year to sort of check the pulse. And that was a useful tool for measuring things because you can drill down on it by team and by office, and it's good about not letting you drill down so deep that you can figure out who said something, but you can drill down to micro groups for sure.
Nice.
And if you ask the right questions in that, and you're trending and tracking over time, you get to some good answers. But there's no substitute for I say this sitting in my home where I've been sitting for the bulk of the last 2.5 years, like everybody. There's no substitute for walking around
Yeah.
and actually seeing what's happening in the office. And you can adapt that to Zoom as much as possible, but you have to check in with people. You have to understand and sort of feel the vibe of different conversations and different meetings and different locations and teams to figure out if the organization is healthy or it's not healthy.
Yeah. One of the things I find that's interesting as well is as a senior leader, when you walk into a room, the whole dynamic of the room changes. Like Matt's here.
Right.
Different in a smaller organization, but as soon as Bolster becomes 50 or 100 or whatever it might be, like there's interesting dynamics and things change as well. And I think leaders need to be seekers and searchers of truth as opposed to the deference or the press that you're offered.
For sure. And the you have to make it safe for people to speak the truth,
Hmm.
and you have to handle feedback in a really, really specific way. And I've written some blog posts about this before. There's like a really simple formula for getting feedback as a senior leader. First, you have to ask for it.
Wait a second. Can we repeat that first step? I think it is very important.
Yeah. You have to ask for the feedback. You have to accept it. And I always say accept it gracefully. And what that means is you can't scowl, you can't fold your arms on your chest, you can't argue it. You can ask for clarification,
Yeah.
you can ask for examples, but you have to accept it gracefully. You have to act on it,
Mm,
at least some of it. You don't have to
yeah.
act on all of it all the time, right? Because sometimes feedback has noise, and just because John says one thing to you doesn't mean that Sally agrees with it,
Yep.
right? But you have to act on elements of it and be intellectually curious about it and do discovery on it, um, and then you have to ask again.
Mm,
And like if you rinse and repeat those 4 steps as a leader, you do an awful lot to make it a safe place to give feedback and to speak up. And that's the kind of thing that is very powerful inside of a culture. And I think your formula there, whether you call it to the power of power or to the power of leaders or to the power of something,
Yeah.
where that really makes sense, that that leaders can absolutely magnify and amplify.
Yeah. And I love this around gracefully accepting the feedback, which doesn't mean you make it the truth,
Right.
but it's someone's truth.
It's someone's truth. Yeah.
And it deserve right. If you deny that it's their truth, you're now going into gaslighting. So I had a really interesting example, Matt, of this where I was asked to come in and give a keynote talk to a all managers of it was a large company, 20,000 people, 1,500 managers. I was asked to come in and give a talk on leadership and good leadership and culture. And the person who brought us in, I had sort of our pre-engagement call. He seemed lovely. We listened to the same podcasts. We read the same books. Like, I could tell he was genuinely passionate about good leadership and culture. And he was the person who spoke just before me. He had to hop and leave and hop a plane and go to another meeting after his talk. So I don't think he stuck around for mine. But after his remarks, he opened up to Q&A. And I think it was the second question out of the gate, which was, what is being done to address high workload and burnout within the culture? To which this guy said, well, we implemented this, that, and that initiative, and so I don't think it's an issue anymore. I'm like, no. Like, the mere fact that someone brought it up, even though you've done some things,
I mean, that's like blinking red lights.
Right? Which is, that's a bit of a shocker to hear.
Yeah, I would have thought that we had addressed that. Clearly we haven't.
And so there's more, though I don't know the full story here yet. We need to dig in more. Thank you for bringing it up. We're going to do something about it.
That's one of the reasons when we did those engagement surveys, we did pulses every quarter.
Yeah.
We did the big one once a year. We'd come out of that and create an organizational development plan. Like, just like you get a review and you create a development plan for yourself, we would do an org development plan.
Nice.
We'd publish it to the company. We'd invite people to comment on it and kind of lock it in. And then when we did those pulses every quarter, we'd actually check in on the 2 or 3 development items. Nice. Not just sort of the broad strokes of engagement, but like, hey, are you seeing us move the needle on the things that we all agreed we wanted to move the needle on?
And do you remember, Matt, what the response rates on those surveys were and what you considered? Because one of the things is, if you get great engagement or pulse scores, but 60% of the employee population.
Yeah. I mean, it was near 100. Nice. We could tell from the tool where there were pockets where maybe it wasn't, and would do some targeted asks of teams, like, hey, make sure you're in there filling it out. But we weren't like pestering everyone to do it. And very, very, very high numbers.
And I'm going to make a statement, but I want you to comment on it. I think, just because you run a 4-time a year employee engagement survey doesn't mean that's your only initiative for employee engagement.
No.
Right? That is but a metric.
That's a metric. But that's a metric the same way turnover is a metric, voluntary turnover or involuntary turnover, or that by manager or that by department. Right? Those are all metrics, but those don't substitute for activity.
Right. Yeah. Beautiful. Awesome. A couple of questions have already come in, which are great, and keep them coming. Here's one very early from Mary that we can circle back to. In your experience, what are some key tips in scaling an organizational culture? How long does the process take once started? Who are the key transmitters of culture? What is the best way to maintain the culture? Wow, Mary, these are great. And asked 4 minutes in. So maybe we've touched on some of these, maybe not, but these are fantastic. Let's go through these, Matt, if you're willing.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to talk about them all together a little bit. There's lots of stories I can drill down on these, but I think I think the most important moment in the evolution of an organization is the moment where the culture stops being the culture of the founder driven by the founder, and it starts being the culture of the organization driven by the organization. And that can happen at different points for different companies. There's no magic to it. A return path, I remember roughly when it happened. And it's very different in our journey at Bolster for lots of reasons. But I felt like I was really the driver and steward of the culture for a long time. And then I felt that there was sort of a transitional moment where I was like, no, it can't just be me. It has to be all the senior people, which was a silly, naive first-time CEO way of thinking about it.
Sure.
Hey, better to have 5, 6 people doing it than one person, right? But the strength in the culture and the scaling of the culture came when we had the aha that actually everybody in the company needed to be a steward of the culture. And the culture got so much stronger, which enabled it to scale. Because I mean, you think about it, like, I don't know, just one person doing something is one thing, and if it's the leader and it counts 2x, 3x, 5x, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But when 100 people are holding each other accountable for values and culture,
Nice.
it is it's an incredibly strong lattice work that you can't break. Where a culture of a founder you can break, the founder can break it with a say-do gap issue, right?
Yeah, which we've seen time and again. I mean, WeWork and
yeah, absolutely, and sometimes it happens intentionally, sometimes it happens unintentionally. But you can't break a culture when 100 or hundreds or thousands of people are holding each other accountable for it. So,
yeah,
it starts with documenting it. It moves on to making sure that you have those artifacts and programs that are aligned with it. And then it's really about weaving the culture and weaving the values into the business process around people. So I say that really intentionally. It doesn't mean that your head of HR is in charge of the culture either.
Yeah.
What it means is that your HR department is responsible for making sure that the business processes that they manage incorporate culture and values. And just track it with the employee life cycle, right? You have to interview people, you have to hire them, you have to onboard them, you have to review them, you have to compensate them, and sometimes you have to fire them and offboard them.
Mm-hmm.
Each one of those steps is an opportunity to weave culture and values into the culture. And all HR is doing is setting up the scaffolding, right? They're making sure that in the interview process that people are asking questions about culture and values, that you're doing reference checks about the things you care about as an organization culturally. That when you're reviewing people, you're reviewing them against that criteria, not just how well is Sally performing in her job, but is she an effective steward of the culture?
Yeah.
And not just meaning, does she play by the rules, but is she making other people play by the rules? Same thing when it comes to compensation. Same thing when it comes to everything. If you have a value of generosity, which a bunch of companies do, and you have a very stingy severance program, right? If you don't give people, post-termination exercise rights on their stock options, or you make it so that they're jammed and they've got 20 days to make a decision, like that's
a say-do gap.
Yeah, it's incongruous with your value of generosity. So, I think it's those three things. It's documenting the values, it's creating those artifacts and programs, and then it's just weaving them in to everything you do with your people.
Yeah. And saying, so if we say this and believe this, how can that manifest in what we're doing in all of these areas? And it shouldn't just be when convenient. It should be when also inconvenient.
Right.
So there's an example I have on this on a New York-based startup that grew and has been successful. They're called NextJump. And they take culture and leadership very seriously. One of the measures they do is a peer review. So they have, if there's a leader, they have their team review their leader, and 50% of their leader's evaluation is their contribution to culture, and the other 50% is their contribution to performance. There's an example of a leader that drove their people so hard that their performance stats in the short run were good, but their team culture was awful. And that leader was offered to either be demoted or they could leave. and they chose a demotion. With the demotion came having to re-enroll in the internal leadership boot camp to relearn what it means to be a leader at this company. And within 2 years, they re-earned a promotion to the same level, but finally got the culture piece right.
That's impressive on behalf of that individual, right? Because usually that's not what you got.
Yeah.
Okay. Usually you get
I'm out of here.
Confusion and departure.
Yeah.
So it actually, speaks volumes that person was willing to go through that. That probably was a good predictor of success going through that process.
Yeah. So one of the things, I'm seeing a question here from Tina, also Mary's question as well. So one of the things we committed to and promised here, Matt, is can we actually scale culture? So I have a belief on this, that culture doesn't necessarily scale. It builds one leader, one person at a time. So I want to reconcile if you agree with that. But can we, you scale a business, you scale processes. Can you actually scale culture? Or is it something that just requires maintenance, attention, seeing how it more is that a worthwhile conversation?
I don't know that the two things are, I don't think it's an either or.
Okay.
I do think you have to tend to culture like a garden, right? You got to weed it. You have to fertilize it. You have to grow it. But I think that's how you scale it. You understand what the business needs and how the business has changed and how the people have changed. You look at the values, right? You look at the things that are bedrock that don't change, and you figure out if there are ways that you need to adapt. And I don't think those two things are at odds with each other. I mean, I'll give you a dumb example. This is one of those artifacts that we had at Return Path. So we used to celebrate people's anniversaries of being at the company. I've always had like a deep dislike for companies that celebrate people's birthdays. And a lot of companies do it, and that's fine if that's their thing. I know there are a lot of people that don't like their birthday being known. They don't want anything to do with that. So we always focused on people's anniversary being at Return Path. And we felt like that was a good thing to celebrate. The fact that we were actually celebrating that was good for the culture. So I used to write a handwritten note to every employee on their anniversary. And we had a gift. There was like the 1-year gift, the 2-year gift, the 3-year gift. And I actually also used to call people on their anniversary. And at some point that just broke. Like I couldn't do it for 500 people. And a similar one was I used to be the final interview for everybody. And the year we hired 125 people, it just broke. Couldn't do it. So those things had to scale in the way that a business scales, right? They became delegatable.
They were delegated.
They were delegated. They became items that could be delegated without losing their meaning. So, I only did half of the final interviews, but you had to have a final interview by someone on the executive team. I kept writing the handwritten notes for people's anniversary, but I didn't do the phone calls. Someone else did the phone calls. So silly examples, but I think those are ways in which you think about scaling up the culture, because if culture is embodiment and artifacts and programs and policies, then those things need to adapt as the organization gets bigger, the same way that your CRM system does, or the same way that your expense policy does.
Nice. Beautiful. A couple of things I'm hearing I want to double click on. So you said culture ought to be documented. There ought to be artifacts. I mean, this is why we have scripture like the Bible and the Quran and other things, because and the Torah, and it goes on, because you have documented fable-based, or a fable-based storied, like we learn from stories and experience. You and I could you could say we're religious about the Sidhu gap, right? Great. But if you share a story of what that means, now it becomes more tangible. So artifacts, stories are really important.
And I have two things about that were practiced. I feel like I'm talking about my prior life, not my current life, but the current company is just small and new, so it's a little hard to. But we had two things that we did, and your example is a great one. One is we did new employee onboarding. We did a roundtable for all new employees, and we ran them pretty regularly. Like, depending on how many people we were hiring, but we probably did at least 6 of them a year. So someone in their first couple months would get an hour, and it was always with the 3 founders of the company, and then 1 or 2 other old timers. Didn't have to be senior people, but people who'd been at the company for a long time. And one of my colleagues used to call it the company oral history project. So very much to your point about biblical, right? Which was orally passed on until someone wrote it down.
The elders,
So we used to go through the values. We had like 15 values or something, which was too many, but it was what worked for us at the time.
Good.
And we would tell a story about each one. Literally tell a story about it. Like, here's the time that here's an example of this in the wild, right? Here's when we use this to make a decision, between A and B.
Nice.
And we just would do that for every single value. So that was part of that process of pushing them forward through the organization and making them real and tangible for people. So it wasn't just like something printed on the wall on a poster, which we didn't even do, but it made them real.
And now we can get into fun with some artifacts as well. So I agree with you. I think 15 is too many. I think you could get it down to probably 5 or 6. I don't think there's any science to prove is there a right number of values to have. But in my experience of helping leaders and organizations doing this, you can usually get down to 5 or 6, a purpose and 5 core values with behaviors underneath.
I think that's right. Yeah, we have Bolster. We have 4 values and 4 operating principles.
Nice. But now I think you can have some fun, especially talking about scale. So now you can bring a film crew to one of those elder sessions and film it. And now you have an artifact. And now, when Bolster, let's say Bolster becomes 500 people as well, and it becomes impossible to have those, not impossible, but harder to have those oral history club sessions, it can be part of company onboarding to have these amazingly, wonderfully produced, engaging, this is a value. Let me tell you about what it looks like in the wild. And now people can use that in the wild when having to make a hard decision and leaning back on a fable and a value and using it and then celebrating it.
Yeah, no, that's right. I also think that one of the things about the documentation process is the less top down it is, the better.
The less top down. Okay.
So I have a story from each company on this one, because we did something at Return Path we learned from and then did it differently at Bolster. At Return Path, we actually didn't have values written down for several years. And I want to say it was like 5, 6, 7 years into the journey, probably 5, that we said, should probably have some values written down.
Yeah.
And we were over 100 people by then. I think we were about 120 or 130 people. And we decided that we wanted to engage the whole company in the process. So we split the company up into a dozen teams of 10, roughly. And it was random. It wasn't like, the engineering team can go do some work and,
cross sections.
Yeah, the Denver office can do some work. It was alphabetically by first name. And each 12th person was like the team captain.
Nice.
Right. Whatever showed up, showed up. And we gave people the exercise of write down the company's values. And each team had to write down the company's values. And the leadership team was not on any of the teams. And we said, okay, our job is going to be, we're going to get these things back, and then we're going to figure out what to do with them. And we got them back, and the level of congruence across a dozen different write-ups was very striking.
Nice.
So what that said to me was that we have a very strong culture. We have very strong values. They've evolved as they've evolved. Hopefully we've been intentional about it, even though we haven't written them down. And the process of getting 120 or 130 people to work on writing them down kind of proved that. So we had an editing job and a wordsmithing job to, take the things that showed up in at least 10, 10 of them, and then put together a doc that people could comment on and edit. And that was how we came up with them. And that was, I think, very powerful for those 130 people that participated in that at the time, because they were like, oh, I said that. So when we started Bolster, we had a big group that started the company. There were actually eight founders, and we wrote the values and the operating principles as a team, and we did it in the, I don't know, the first week or the first month or the first quarter, very early on. And they weren't the same as the ones from Return Path. They borrowed on them heavily. There's you would, when we've hired people from Return Path, they feel like they're walking into a familiar building.
Yeah. Or familiar culture. Yeah.
Right. But they, right, because there is no building. But we wrote them as a group, the 8 of us, early on. So right away, it wasn't me, right? But that was the founder, even though it was a bunch of people.
Yeah.
But, the couple of times since then that we've done all company meetings, we've actually had that as a session, which is values and operating principles red line. And same thing every time, split up into teams.
Oh, nice.
Tackle them, do a red line, come back together. And that's really helped us shape I would say with the values, it hasn't changed the values because we say values don't change. It has shaped the wording around them to make them clearer.
Yep.
And then it really has shaped the operating principles, which are designed to be a little more flexible and fluid. So
can you rhyme any of those off of what those values and operating principles are? This isn't a test, but just to make this real for
yeah, absolutely. I love I think acronyms or whatever mnemonic devices are quite helpful for this. So ours are ABCD. So the 4 values are A, always have heart. And there's a sentence behind each of these, but I'll just give you the headlines. B is be welcoming. C is continuous growth. And D is do the right thing. And then we have 4 operating principles, which are also ABCD. So that's A, agile. B, be honest with ourselves. C, count every penny. And D, darn simple.
Nice.
So hopefully those are, those are things that even on the headline without the sentence behind it, that are clear-ish.
And count every penny doesn't necessarily mean be frugal. It just means keep track of what you're spending and what you're earning.
So here's the wording around it. We invest wisely to create a strong and sustainable business in the near term.
Nice.
Which
doesn't mean you have to say at the Holiday Inn while the CEO says it's the 4 seasons.
That's right. That's right. But the first version of it, the one that was redlined to be the thing you just heard, talked about not spending money where we absolutely don't have to. We spend money like it's our own money. And those things aren't false anymore, but people thought it was a better embodiment of that principle to talk about investing wisely and having a sustainable business.
So what I love about this, and I haven't seen organizations do this as often as you do, which is we revisit it, we review it, we ensure that the articulation of it matches the essence and meaning. If we find a better way to articulate it, we share it and bring it to the team. And also, I think it keeps us honest to evaluate and say, okay, we hold this to be dear and true. Are we actually living it?
Are we living it?
Yeah. If we're not living it, that's the biggest red line of all.
Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. I know we have a couple minutes left here and some amazing things that have come in here. One of the things I wanted to throw by you, Matt, is when it comes to interviews, I'm a really big believer in creating interviews that are also experiential. Right? Like you and I could sit across each other from a table virtually or physically, and I could say, Matt, tell me a time when you exhibited, counting every penny, well, good review to ask. I checked out your values on the website and I have a canned answer for this. Or, I'm a big believer in taking people out for a meal or conducting an interview in an escape room. Right? Like figuring out. So a great example of this, my sister was interviewing for a job that required certain characteristics. Improvisation, good bedside manner, ability to explain complex ideas in simple ways. That's what the job required. And so in the last interview, is with 3 panelists, they asked her out of the blue with no preparation, teach us something that you're passionate about.
Yeah.
And she went, shit. and then she asked them to stand up. She said, I love dance. I'm going to choreograph and teach you a dance. And use a 5-minute ditty or whatever. But
good on her.
But they weren't looking for, can she teach us to be better dancers?
Right.
They were looking at her ability to explain complex ideas in simple ways. So
For sure.
I love that. I love
I,
that.
100%. So I love taking people out for meals. I think that's good for lots of reasons. It's good to be somewhat social in a final interview.
It's good to see how they treat
it's
the
good to see
wait staff.
how they treat the wait staff. I was just about to say that. Like that's my long time head of HR from many years ago. Angela used to say that. She had this great expression, which was everything is data in an interview process, and like how they treat the wait staff is data in the interview process. But the other thing we're big believers in at Bolster is the audition. And so what your friend went through was an audition, right? Like teach us how to dance, teach us how to, right? But you know, at Return Path, when we had scale, we wouldn't hire a sales rep without having them pitch us. And ideally, they were pitching us on us, but they could have pitched us on anything. They had to stand up and actually do a pitch. Even today, we don't hire engineers without watching them write code. And one of the things we do at Bolster is we help companies hire board members, right? So we do placements of executives and of part-time execs and consultants, but also members of their board of directors. And I do a lot of coaching of CEOs, our clients, as they're going through the hiring process for board members. And I always advise them to do an audition, which means when you have your finalist, and you have to get it down to one because it's the quirk of that particular job. You can't have 3 finalists to go through this. But when you get down to your finalist, you invite them to attend a board meeting before you put them on the board. And you say to them, you're not here to observe, you're here to be a board member.
Nice.
And I'm going to make it work for you. I'm going to send you the materials, you know, ahead of time, like I'm sending them to the board. And I'm going to sit with you for 2 hours before the board meeting and answer every question you have about the material. So you don't feel like there's a dumb question or a dumb comment and you're afraid to speak, but I'm going to expect that you participate in the board meeting as if you were a director. I've bounced people out of the board selection process before at the audition stage. And it's tough because you've gotten to the point where you've both said, yeah, this is great, or I want to do this. But there's one guy I'm thinking of in particular, I thought was going to be a perfect independent board member. And I had had an outstanding board at Return Path. I have an outstanding board at Bolster, very different board. But some very strong voices in the room, you know, VCs in particular, very, very strong, and lots of experience and lots of good opinion. And so very important to me to have independent directors that can speak up and that can go toe to toe with, you know, with a strong will,
outspoken
VC,
high ego.
And I had a guy who showed up even after I said to him, this is an audition. I really need you to weigh in on this topic, and this topic, and didn't say boo the whole board meeting. And, you know, just couldn't have been more clear that was never going to work as a board member. So whatever the audition is, whatever the role is, I agree with you. I think it's much better to be experiential than to just be Q&A.
Totally. And did you have a debrief with that board member in question and say what happened and why didn't you speak up?
I did. I mean, I think it was clear to
them as well.
It was clear to him, that it wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
So it was not as painful a debrief as it could have been. But yeah.
Nice. So I love that, giving the experience. I mean, one of the things that I've seen sales teams do as well, if improvising on the job is important, is to say, hey, pitch us on our own products or services, have that, evaluate the pitch, and then say, great, now sell us this pen. Right? Like totally out of the blue, no prep. And you see if indeed improvisation is important. If improvisation is not important, don't make them improvise.
Or in that one, like you see what their go-to is, right? There are lots of you know, different sales methodologies, but generally you want to be selling value and not selling features and functions. And tell someone to sell you a pen, and you can see what their go-to is right away, because they know both the value of the pen and the features and functions of the pen, or they can make them up.
Yeah.
So you see where they gravitate.
Yeah. Have an idea, have a to-do list. I have something for you. Very good. Matt, you've been so generous. This has been awesome. I feel like we're just scratching the surface and could go for hours more, but this has been great. Any closing words or things we have yet to discuss that you think is important in this conversation on how to scale culture? And anything else you want to share before we log off? I know you have a very active blog. You have a 3rd book coming out Anything else you want to share with everyone here?
I would just say, on the topic of scale and culture, that um, I think no matter what your culture is, um, there's a premium that you can put um, on employee retention. And
Mm.
again, like if when it comes to scaling a culture, right? If you care about it, if you have a super high churn environment, it's very hard for there to be consistency over time. And you can do the oral history project with all new employees, but if you're educating the entire workforce on the culture, every year or two, it's very tricky.
It's a lot of
Um,
work.
it's a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think retention is an excuse for people not to grow and chat. Like
No.
if you have 100% retention, that may not be a sign of health either. Like I think people should move on to new challenges and other things,
Mhm.
but I think having strong retention is indicative of people are choosing to stay here.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, this has been great. I'm keen to keep following all the things that you do at Bolster and beyond, and staying in touch. This has been a great convo. I hope it has been valuable for all of you listening out there. And we'll see you again very soon. Thank you again, Matt.
All right. Thanks, Chad.
Cheers.